Hello and welcome to the Safety Brief, your go-to live stream, video, or podcast, depending on how you tune in, for the latest insights in cybersecurity. I'm your host, Elizabeth, and today we're diving into the complex world of cybersecurity legislation and compliance. Joining me is Matt and Mike. Welcome back for another week of spreading awareness.
Thanks so much.
So
Hello.
let's hello. So let's kick things off. Can you give us an overview of some of the most significant cybersecurity regulations that have been introduced recently, and what should our listeners or partners be aware of?
Yeah, so for those listening, they could come from a variety of different, how do you say, vantage points, right? So there could be government oversight, regulatory compliances in the form of CMMC, which is backed by NIST, 800, 171, and those frameworks. There's also CIS, which is found more in the technology managed security space because of the easy to understand controls and implementation groups. But for those that are maybe in medical or finance, they're very familiar with HIPAA and PCI DSS. And these regulatory compliances have grown and evolved over time to have to incorporate cybersecurity concepts because of everything going paperless, everything going digital, moving from the physical to the logical, and in the way of data archive and where these files are kept and how this data is kept. And so ultimately, there is a lot of federal legislation. There's also local state legislation, as we've discussed on previous episodes as well. But the compliance component is just kind of clarify the concept here for those that may not be familiar is there is a certification framework that will find itself in multiple different governing bodies. Like I said, HIPAA is one, PCI is one, CMMC is another, CIS is another. But these frameworks are, think of them as recommended best practices or industry best practices targeting a certain vertical. Now, HIPAA is obviously medical providers and how PII and PHI, privileged health-related data, needs to be protected. And, PCI DSS is how to protect that information, which is crucial to financial organizations processing, accepting payments, and storing customer data in the form of payment methods and billing addresses and credit cards, routing numbers, etc. And so with this, there's obviously incredibly large cybersecurity implications, as we're discussing today, but that's a high-level overview of what maybe some more common ones are in the space today, but by no means an exhaustive list.
If I were to chime in, I would say that honestly, I just don't think that there's enough. If we really want to break it down, there's not enough. There isn't enough oversight at this current time, and that's becoming very evident in the fact that we have governing bodies that are being hit with attacks, and they're supposed to be the ones that are the framework that everybody else is using to prevent the attack. So what happens when the people that are telling you how to prevent attack get hit with an attack that they couldn't prevent? It seems a little bit counterintuitive.
No, I
Yeah,
totally agree.
agreed.
And for our listeners and partners, staying aware of these regulations is vital because non-compliance can lead to hefty fines or damage to your reputation. It's about safeguarding sensitive information and respecting user privacy across all digital interactions. So, how do these regulations vary across different industries? What are some key challenges companies face when trying to comply with standards?
Yeah, challenges are definitely going to be presenting themselves in a variety of forms. Number one is going to be the adoption of such security controls, right? It's one thing to have a control such as multi-factor authentication required for all users, but we know whether you're listening as those trying to implement security controls or those maybe fighting a tooth and nail against some of these governing compliance policies, right? We understand there's a level of inconvenience that's been had historically with some of these things. No different than if you go to visit a friend in a gate guarded or a gated community. You got to stop. You got to pull up to this long line. You got to show your ID, and then you got to have somebody call your friend or your family member, and then get approval. Right? It's cumbersome.
Mm-hmm.
It's cumbersome by nature. And the interesting thing is most of the perspective is one of negativity when it's okay, well, what am I exchanging? because there is an exchange taking place in this interaction. There is, you are giving up some level of convenience, and in exchange you are receiving or obtaining a higher level of metaphorical security in this instance, right? Obviously, it's a gate guarded community, but in the instance of multi-factor authentication, right, I am giving up a moment of convenience, of accessibility, for higher levels of security. Well, most people say, well, it's harder for me to log in, so I will get my job done. Well, it's like, indeed, it is harder for you to log in. That is by design the point, right? And so, within the scope of these compliance frameworks, we've seen some be more maybe difficult to implement or quote unquote intrusive than others. But the goal is to, again, build resilience against downtime rather than introduce downtime. Now, the ideal of that is to reduce downtime, but we've seen a lot of instances in this space where organizations have sought to deploy cybersecurity controls and down themselves in the process, right? We're seeking to prevent downtime, yet we're perpetuating this pain we're seeking to prevent. So that's why, making sure you measure twice, cut once before the implementation phase of this stuff is important. No different than change management under an ITIL framework or anything like that, but specifically being able to see, number one, what's the risk if I don't implement this control from a security perspective? Number two, what's the risk when I implement this control from a business productivity perspective? And what are you trading in that instance, right? Again, giving up a level of maybe productivity or accessibility for higher measures of security. And so you forget your badge at work and you got to show your badge to get through the gate. Guess what? You're not getting to work, at least in the DoD side, right? Like, you're not getting on base. You're going to miss work. You're not going to be at work. And that's the impact, right? But what's the exchange? Well, there's a higher level of security at that place. It's okay. Everybody forgets their badge. Everybody loses every once in a while. Just come on in. And, again, it's, in some places that's okay, right? But what I'm saying is the scale is very tangible. It exists. It is literal. But I would say, the differentiation between the regulations is going to vary specific to, candidly, how mature that industry is. And so we're seeing a lot of emphasis swing on the pendulum towards a core infrastructure as far as regulatory compliance as a security mechanism. Not a lot of people think about how secure your local power plant is, but most drive by it and there's maybe a 6-foot fence and a baby padlock on the gate. It's, well, what does that do? Well, that single location is responsible for powering about 10,000 homes in the community. Why is it less secure? Well, we've never thought about it that way, right? And so I think with the events the past 24 months have presented us, there is a heightened awareness over core infrastructure, how to secure it, both physically and logically via cybersecurity means. But the awareness typically precedes the regulation. As we become more aware of the attack surface that we have as a country, as a company, as a small mom pop shop, whatever it is, that typically precedes it. So the cycle is usually awareness of the attack surface, unfortunately preceded by some major attack that is not safeguarded, and then a heightened awareness of it, and then a heightened regulation. Now, what does that present as a dilemma for us is that compliances are often far behind and lagging to what real-time need is. And I'm making a bold claim here, but there's historical precedent for this. If you look up the Titanic, right, so it's a common story most people know, if not, very large ship, claimed to be unsinkable, took a transatlantic trip, from one continent to the other. And at the time, encountered some significant issues, ended up sinking, and there was a lot of scrutiny over the number of lifeboats built into the Titanic and how it could have, so many hundreds of people on this boat, but only 15 to 20 lifeboats. Well, the reality of the situation is at the time, the British Board of Trade had a regulatory compliance on how many lifeboats were needed on a vessel that size. The Titanic had 5 more boats than was required by the compliance. So the compliance at the time was set,
not there.
and they went above and beyond the compliance at the time. And still, hundreds of, tens of decades later, we're still looking at this being like, this was ridiculous. Who could ever think that this made sense? And that's why I say there's typically preceded by a very specific event that highlights a level of lack of security or lack of safety, either public or private, and then regulatory compliance follows. But I think the myth I want to make sure we bust on this discussion is just because you are compliant or have attained to compliance don't by any means become complacent from a security posture.
Not a set and forget.
Yeah, indeed.
So, like Mike said, the challenge for compliance lies in navigating this regulatory maze while ensuring their cybersecurity measures are robust enough to meet these standards. It's a balancing act between compliance and operational efficiency. So, what are some primary goals behind these new cybersecurity laws, and how are they designed to enhance the overall security posture of organizations? Um, I believe it will help foster a culture of more vigilance, in my opinion.
I honestly think that it's going to foster a culture of checking a box, but that's just me.
We've seen
Because
that in our field. We've actually had people ask, "Can you show us what boxes you check?"
yeah,
So I
and
get that.
that's the thing. I mean, I've worked with bodies that have had to go through uh, compliance for HIPAA. I mean, this is something that should be a no-brainer. You should want to adhere to the requirements that are put in place by HIPAA. It's personal information, but it slowed down their workday. They couldn't get things done quicker as quickly as they wanted to, because if you needed to do something as simple as a password change, you had a multi-step process to go through to authorize a password change. It involved having things in writing. People didn't want to wait on that. So instead, they would get their boss to call in and say, "Hey, change the password." They would get told no, and then they would get adamant, and then they'd get hung up on. So how are you, expediting your daily tasks by trying to circumvent things that need to be done? Well, that was their entire goal. They wanted to try and find a way they could streamline the entire process. And that's what's going to happen, unfortunately, with a lot of these new requirements and regulations and everything else that are coming out. I hate to say it, but they're being put together by people that are clueless. They're trying to make this as secure as humanly possible, but then they're trying to get people that are not security minded to try and adhere to them. Those people are the same ones that, try to find any way they can to authenticate a program that they got illegally, because they don't want to go through the process of following a set method of getting an object. And what worries me is we're going to have very large businesses, extremely large businesses, that are going to start looking at purchasing software. The software may do just enough to check that box, but it's not going to provide the level of protection that you actually need. It checked a box, though. So when you get, breached, or somebody gets into your environment, or data gets, let out because it technically did not cover enough, that company is going to be covered because it did exactly what the program said that it would. The problem will be on the company themselves for not ensuring they didn't have other controls in place.
Indeed. I think the interesting component that Matt's points bring up is that there is a lot of, I don't want to say false hope, but there can be a false sense of security for those that go through a significant amount of due diligence. Mind you, I'm not diminishing the effort put out to obtain a SOC 2 or a HIPAA or a PCI DSS or a GDPR or whatever the compliance is you have to navigate. That is a substantial amount of effort for good reason, meaning these regulatory compliances, pivoting to the end user, everyday layman's perspective. Why do these compliances exist? Well, it's to make sure that those that are charging money to do business in a certain vertical maintain a level of hygiene from a business practice perspective, right? So meaning if you are going to do banking, if you're going to accept, receive, and transmit payments, then you are subject to PCI DSS, which has a framework of rules and regulations and stipulations and says, hey, you have to process data this way. You have to handle data this way. Now, what has become normalized is a culture of not adhering to that or passing those certifications, yet still exhibiting failures in implementation. So you've seen cell phone providers, banking institutions, Capital One breach, Amazon breach, T-Mobile customer data breach, whatever it is. These breaches of data, they are significantly sized enterprises. These are not small mom pop credit union down the street growing into a larger business, whatever it is. These are major billion-dollar corporations, if not trillion-dollar corporations. They had to meet their compliance. There's no chance they didn't. So how then did they still get popped? Well, come back to the sense that compliance is often preceding the needs of reality as it stands today. Are they good frameworks to follow? Yes, by any means, but they ought to be the starting point. Similar to how the Titanic took whatever the compliance was at the time, multiplied it by a delta of 25% more than what was required as a minimum, and started there. They made some bold claims. They were awfully confident about that ship and the capabilities it had for obvious reasons. But again, in retrospect, everything's 2020. And so we're not being hypercritical of it as much as providing a very realistic, candor-filled, let's take a genuine look, honestly, at compliance in cybersecurity and say, hey, is it good to chase? Yes. But it'll also be something that if it takes certifications every 3 years to update to current technology and current implementation practices, how far much more behind is compliance, which is sometimes made, to Matt's point, by technical thought leaders in the space, or could just be those that were in charge of the compliance for banking and medical, but know more about banking and medical than they do about technology. And the one thing that has changed is the technology. Blood types have not changed. Diseases, for the most part, has not changed. Payment methods, to certain degrees, whether it be fiat or crypto, buying something and transmitting that fund has not changed. The technology interweaving all of these things has greatly changed.
Yeah.
And so
the fabrics are what's really adaptive.
Right. And so the difficulty that we've seen is we'll see practitioners that say, hey, I know a lot about insurance, so I know cyber insurance. Well, the difficulty that we're seeing with cyber insurance questionnaires or prerequisites or qualification forms is, number one, they're not uniform across any single industry like they are in auto, fire, home, renters, whatever, right? Like every single home insurance policy is going to ask the age of the home, the construction materials of the home, the square footage of the home, the cost of your possessions in the home, the location of the home, right? Yeah. Every single form is going to ask that standardized set of questions. If you look at a cyber insurance form today, they're going to say things like, do you have the cyber? Do you got the seam? Check box if you have SOAR. Please say yes here if you have an EDR. Another form is going to say, is your EDR managed? Is your EDR white glove deployed? Is your EDR US based? The questions are so vast from a left to right lateral limit right now that for those listening who are familiar with some of these forms, you may be giggling to yourself thinking, yeah, it's crazy. That's the difficulty of it right now. And why is this difficult? Well, all insurance is based off of an algorithm, meaning a level of risk that is calculated over time. And that's why when I was 16 and I got car insurance, my premium was exponentially higher than when I'm whatever age, right? And so the reason is at that age, at that gender, at that time of life, there's sometimes exceptionally more risk that is taken. And thus, you're a greater risk to the insurance company, and thus you get a higher rate. With cyber, it's all over the place right now. And so they're looking for ways to mitigate. They're looking for ways to measure. All the power to them. And this isn't a disparaging insurance type of conversation. It's just a reality that compliance, insurance, a lot of these things meant to put soft bumpers around the risk associated with these aspects of life are having a difficult time keeping up.
And there's a couple other things about that as well. What is one of the number one things that you notice about insurance as a whole?
It's expensive.
Okay. Well, that kind of touches on what I was.
That was the mic answer, but
thank you for the obvious answer, Captain. So in your area, let's say that you live in, the commonly known as Tornado Alley area of the country. Commonalities in that area are you're going to have storms that have big stones of ice that come down, called hail, or as we also like to call fast pitch sky softball. Sometimes it's fun, sometimes it's really not. The problem that you run into with insurance, you could have rates that actually go up even though you were not involved in any sort of an action. Look at the auto industry. I had my insurance for my car went up exponentially. I called and said, "Why is it going up? I haven't had any accidents, any claims, nothing since I was like 20 something." And they said, "Oh, well, there were a whole bunch of claims in your area for hail damage. So for us to offset our expenses, everybody's rates are increasing." Okay, well, that's fantastic. But that impacts me even though I didn't see any benefit from it. So now I'm paying more while somebody else got a brand new car because they were dumb and left their car sitting outside during a hailstorm. Note to self, leave my car outside in a hailstorm. Not saying it's a good plan. I'm just saying it's a plan. The other thing that you're going to run into is, and again, I don't want to single out certain aspects of the security industry, but certifications, as we talked about. What's something that's actually happened over time with those certifications? They become adaptive. There's no longer, like back in the day, the early Microsoft courses, those were a nightmare. Trying to pass those, you had to actually know everything that you were working on in order to successfully pass and show mastery. Then people complained and said they were too tough. And now all the other certifications have started to follow what they're doing, and it's easy question, slightly harder question, super hard question. Oh, you screwed that question up. Easy question. And it goes back. So now all you have to do is get 3 or 4 questions right, miss a hard question, go back and do the easy questions again, and you're going to pass the certification. Doesn't mean you've actually mastered anything. It just means that you're really good at answering softball questions. So that carries over to the compliance aspect. You have people that are going in to get certified. They may be taking these certifications, but how much do they actually know? How much mastery do they have? Are they an actual practitioner of what they're getting certified in? Or was it purely, hey, we need more people that are certified in order for us to pass our compliance? Everybody go and take this test. And, obviously, the more people you send in, the more chance you have of people actually passing it. So you blanket the test. You're going to come out of it with having enough that you're going to be able to say, yeah, we have enough certifications to meet this requirement. The problem is you have a bunch of people that may just be interested in that area, but they don't do that for their actual role. So it's not benefiting you as an organization. So having compliance, having governance, having all of this in place, it's great. It's oversight. But who's watching the watchman? Who's ensuring that oversight is being properly applied within environments? Who's making sure that mastery is being upheld? If you have some kind of an egregious breach, you can't come back and say, well, we have our certifications. The box was checked. They don't care that box was checked. People are going to be upset. Their information's out there. Rightfully so.
Yeah. So speaking of breaches, I know companies like Equifax face significant challenges navigating cybersecurity compliance following their data breach. I think that they definitely took some key lessons, such as the importance of robust cybersecurity frameworks and proactive risk management, the need for transparent communication and swift response to breaches, and continuous monitoring and compliance auditing to uphold standards. Like Matt said, it's not just taking a test and checking boxes, it's knowing what you're doing and how you're doing it. So, can you share an example or more examples of companies that have had to navigate through intricate cybersecurity compliance requirements and what lessons they may have learned from that experience or that we can learn from that experience?
I mean, we could go with MITRE if we really want to. I mean, the governing body over, attack techniques ends up losing to an attack. Just because you have the framework doesn't mean that the framework is actually implemented or working the right way. You have to have people that are overseeing that. You have to have people that are ensuring that everything is being handled the proper way. But the most important thing that you have to try and just in some way factor are humans. Humans are emotional beings. We don't operate on pure logic. If we were, we would be more in the Star Trek era than anything else. I mean, Spock was completely logical. Yes, he had his human side, but just like most of us, he tries to ignore that human side when we're doing cyber stuff because you can't let it get in the way. But that's the problem you run into with these frameworks. That's the problem you run into with governance. You can have everything that you want in place, but you have to try and figure out the chaos element. One person making one mistake because their head is not clear, and you have a situation on your hands that you didn't think you were going to have to deal with.
Exactly. I think the lesson there is thought leadership doesn't automatically assume a mastery of implementing. And I think the frameworks that are out there today are certainly venturing off into thought leadership. They are trying to set a new standard for a very vast space of industries across a vast number of budgets, across a vast number of counties, cities, states, cultures, creeds, right? Like there's a lot. Whenever you're setting a compliance, it's got to take into a lot of different variables, and it can't be unattainable. It has to be attainable. And so if you're in a classroom of 55 students and those students come from different learning backgrounds, learning methods, how they learn, how they've learned, how they've been taught over time, if you need to ensure that my job is to make sure they all pass, well, you're going to have to do something to the test that ensures such an outcome. And if not every student feels like they had a chance to pass the test, well, then it gets really dicey because maybe they weren't ever allowed to succeed, right? And so when I say these analogies, I mean, if a business is out there trying to be a small mom pop dental practice, HIPAA needs to be accessible as much to them as it does to TRICARE or these major medical enterprises, right? And so now you have a very vast budget, you have a very vast staffing, very vast geographic location and footprint and what that looks like. Some of them are international, and now you're subject to multiple cybersecurity compliances. But I think the premise here is that if we have to understand compliance better, we have to understand that it is built so that it is attainable and it can't be built out of reach. And so thus there are going to be some compromises in some form or fashion, right? And that doesn't mean that the compliance is bad. It just means is that it needs to be developed in a way that is accessible so that those businesses generating livelihoods for their employees can still do business in that space. And right now we're seeing a lot of innovation in the CMMC spectrum with DoD and defense industrial base pipeline supply chain providers. It's not if you put pilots in the F-22s or F-35s, it's if you melt and compound and build aircraft grade aluminum, you are thus in the supply chain of the defense industrial base if that aluminum lands on an F-35 or whatever it is. So now you, incredibly blue collared, best at what you and your family have done for years, which is blacksmithing and metal melding and all of this, are now in a CMMC cybersecurity framework, right? And so what you're now subject to is having to learn something very different than your craft, very different than what you're gifted at. And to Matt's point, we see implementation sometimes happen with thought leadership in cybersecurity, and sometimes implementation happens without it. And that's a privilege that some companies have and others don't. But we need to acknowledge that it exists.
Never thought I'd see the day that a metallurgist would actually have to learn the cybersecurity framework.
Well, speaking of that, I would like to break that down a little bit more. So, speaking of small businesses, how can small to medium-sized enterprises effectively manage and implement cybersecurity compliance measures, especially, like you said, when resources are limited and you don't have that vast number of employees and money to spend?
Partner with somebody that has the knowledge and has the capability to go through, do a proper assessment, see where you are compliant, see where you're not compliant, and then give you let's say, a practical roadmap on how you achieve that compliance. A lot of the frameworks that are out there they're assuming that you are a relatively large shop, that you have all of these resources available to you. Not many of them take a look and say, well, these 3 and 4 person companies aren't going to have all of this at their disposal. They may not have time or understanding to go through and even look at compliance. Compliance may not have even been something on their radar because they were a paper company. I mean, with all of the new frameworks that are coming out, as Mike said, there are companies that are being thrust into the requirements of meeting these compliance frameworks that never had to before. So now they're going to have to completely retool everything that they're doing to ensure that they're meeting the requirement just because they printed documents for, a joint task force, of which all of them were burned after they were read, and there's none left, but they were part of that supply chain. So now they're going to have to be read into all of the compliance aspects around that.
Right. Yeah, I would say, we always try to keep this discussion on the safety brief both street smarts and book smarts, right? Like we need to know the book smarts in and out of what is compliance, what is legislation, at least at a high level overview. But it's and not very valuable to real life if we don't give some practical implementation of it. And so within the scope of small to medium businesses, I would say take inventory of what you've already done using a framework that is easy to understand. I would say CIS currently is one of the easiest. I wouldn't say the easiest to understand. I think it's one of the most simply written and outlined frameworks today for cybersecurity because it's very specific and it's very intentional in how it describes it. So in contrast, CMMC may ask, is MFA present within organizational systems that carry CUI, right? Like very, very out there, very vague. CIS may, and it's not, granted, they're two different frameworks for two different reasons, but CIS is more so, do all service administrator accounts with higher access of privilege have MFA rolled out to them and audited routinely, right? Like it's an easy yes or no. There are certain frameworks that get more granular and they have to be very subject to interpretation at times based on the assessment. Again, it comes back to the point of a lot of different environments, a lot of different things may or may not be applicable. And so something practical for small to medium enterprises is look at CIS, look at it as a framework, start to use, and there's nothing paid to get a CIS framework, right? You just look it up. It's data that you would look at, whatever that framework is. Same for NIST 800-171. You can look up these indicators of what they would consider as good hygiene in implementation group 1, 2, and 3. But 1 is very, very attainable. It is very simple. It is very cut and dry. It is something easy to understand. And you as an owner can look at this and say, hey, I can take a little bit of due diligence and not only deliver great product or service, whatever you deliver, but I can also exhibit a level of due diligence that everybody is increasingly caring about more and more. And that is cybersecurity and the prevention of leaks of their data, leaks of their information that they've given over, blindly trusting that it's going to be stewarded well. And the ultimate reality of that is maybe it was stewarded well, maybe it wasn't, but either way, it's still leaking. And we got to solve this problem. And so I would say practically look at CIS, review the framework at an implementation group 1 level, take inventory. If you're not a technical resource, find your most trustworthy technical resource in your business. If you don't have one in your business, feel free to reach out to a Blockworks, reach out to an MSP, or reach out to somebody that is in your regional location that can at least answer some of these questions, at least provide some form of guidance in this way. And where Blockworks is going to fit is more so in providing the controls that meet some of these compliances. We are not an assessment organization. We're not in the CMMC space. We're not a C3PAO. We're an RPO. And that just means we're a registered practitioner organization, which provides services to consult with, partner with, provide, hey, if you are looking to attain these levels of controls, here's where we can help out. If it's endpoint security, if it's cloud security, things of that nature, right? And so I think, again, practically speaking, as Matt said, you got to take inventory of where you're at today. That requires a level of honesty and self-reflection that may be uncomfortable. You may fail it. You may flunk it. Don't change the line. Change what your strategy is to implement what is a standard. And so CIS again is a very, I would say it's an excellent starting point for someone that has never ventured off into the realm of cybersecurity legislation or compliance, specifically within a framework that they would seek to be assessed for and attain.
I know, and of course, educating employees on security best practices and incident response is always important as well. So, given the global nature of cybersecurity threats, how do international cybersecurity laws impact multinational organizations? What challenges could they face in complying with different frameworks?
Yeah, that's hard mode, is what that is, right? It's
That's
everything about
challenge mode.
it's everything about compliance and everything we've talked about, and maybe some we've got a couple of glazed eye, zoned out listeners because of how complex this can get really quick. But to keep it simple, it is one thing if you live in a unincorporated neighborhood with no
Hmm.
HOA, with no city, local jurisdiction, municipality jurisdiction, and you just got to attain to the laws of the country. And what is that? Pay your tax, whatever else it is. I'm not going to go into it because I can't think of all that right now, but there is a federal oversight level that all of us as citizens have to subject ourselves to. Now,
Mhm.
there is also state. Now there is also county. Now there is also city. And now there is also community, right? And so for
Yep.
those that are already like, I'm not a fan of taxes, right? Here we are. But I think the point is you can understand the complexity of multiple overlapping and simultaneously applicable. You can't just satisfy one and not the other. You got to pay your city, you got to pay your county, you got to pay your state, and you got to pay your country. And so that is very much what global international companies have to deal with, and that's navigating what are the laws of the country that they operate in, not even what they have as a company in their home or country or county of origin, right? And so I think again, the analogy I can give is that you got to pay your HOA, you got to pay your city, you got to being aligned with whatever the signage and the color of your house and the size of your yard and the way it's maintained. There's a lot of overlapping things, right? And so I think SMB won't be as subject to that, but larger scale enterprises certainly understand the complexity of it, and they have dedicated, fully staffed 10 to 15 to 20 to 25, 30 sometimes employees just dedicated to a single framework and however many they're subjected to, right? Multiply that department by. And so, but needless to say, it's not going away, and it's only going to grow as threat grows. And as Matt said, the regulation in attempts to create a safer, more air gapped space doesn't mean we're always going to be secure or safe from any threat or risk, but the goal is to minimize the blowback range of it and minimize the impact to organizations that have certain resiliencies in place, right? And in these, it's interesting because if you look at some of these cybersecurity frameworks from a compliance standpoint, they're not all security that are prevention centric. A lot of it is, can you still conduct business even in the event of a cyber attack? So the
Hmm.
goal is not of the framework, stop every attack that hits you. The
Yeah.
goal is, can you secure your employees, your customer data, and continue delivering service in a stable, forecastable fashion so that your business doesn't go under, right?
It's
And
about
then
having resiliency and redundancy in place.
exactly. And so as you unpack more of these cybersecurity compliances, what you'll start to notice is a lot of undertones of resilience, rigidity, durability, and endurance, more so than stop every bad guy. Now,
Mhm.
strategically, that's okay. Blockworks is going to be prevention centric. We're stopping every bad guy. But the goal is of compliance is to, again, build in that rigidity that even if something like that would happen, you could still deliver services and customers and products to your customers and thus fulfill the livelihood of your staff.
Yeah, so it truly is a balancing act between compliance and operational efficiency, like I said previously. So, well, that's a wrap up on today's episode. A big thank you to Matt and Mike for shedding light on this important topic, and thank you to our listeners for tuning in. Join us next time for more cybersecurity tips and trends. And until then, stay safe and stay frosty.
Thanks all.